Celeste Harlow stepped down from the gleaming black SUV as night had already settled over the Chicago suburbs. The wrought iron gates of the Kade estate closed behind her with a heavy metallic groan, like one last warning, but she didn't turn around. There was nothing left to turn back to. 27 years old, widowed for 3 years, with no close family, and no future beyond the towering stack of unpaid bills on the table and the eviction letter from the last miserable apartment she had left. She had never imagined she would set foot in a place like this. But fate didn't ask for her permission. 1 week earlier, a lawyer in a black suit had walked into the St. Catherine Free Clinic at 2 o'clock in the morning and placed a contract in front of her. Care for a VIP patient for 3 months, and in return every debt would be erased, along with a sum of money large enough to let her begin her life again. No name of the patient, no explanation why. Only the statement that Dorothy Kade had been watching her for a long time and believed she was the only suitable choice. Celeste knew the Kade name. Anyone in Chicago knew it. The most powerful Mafia family in the city. Dangerous, ruthless, but she looked down at her hands. The hands that had once saved lives and then been rejected by the entire medical world simply because she had dared to speak the truth when a male doctor had spoken wrongly, and she signed her name. Now she was walking into that world of money and power to care for a dying man. Elias Kade, the head of the family, was slipping toward death. A savage illness was consuming him day by day, stealing his strength and turning the man who had once made all of Chicago tremble with a single look into a suffering ghost in a sickbed. Celeste had only seen him once in passing at the clinic about a year earlier. Tall, commanding, moving as though the whole world ought to step aside for him. His blue eyes had been so cold that the air around him seemed to freeze. 36 years old, at the height of his power. And now, according to the contract's dry and merciless language, he lay curled in sweat-soaked sheets, his hands trembling too badly to hold a glass of water, his hair gone, racked by tearing agony that no medicine could soothe. More than a dozen world-class specialists had examined him, consulted with one another, and shaken their heads. There was nothing left to be done. Dorothy hadn't hired Celeste to cure him, because that was impossible, but only to bring her grandson some measure of comfort in his final days. And Celeste accepted not out of compassion, but because she needed the money, needed a way out of the pit life had pushed her into since the day her husband died in the fire and everything she had once owned turned to ash. But what she didn't know was that Elias Kade's illness concealed a secret darker than anything in the underworld itself. Those medical experts hadn't been wrong. They had been deceived. And when Celeste began asking the questions no one else dared ask, when she refused to accept what the whole world had already accepted, the unthinkable happened. She fell in love with the man she was only supposed to comfort in his last days. She fell in love with the dying Mafia boss, the man she believed had only a few weeks left to live. But was it real love? Or only pity for someone on the edge of death? And behind the closed doors of the Kade estate, who truly wanted Elias dead, and was willing to kill anyone who stood in the way? If this story touched your heart, press the like button so I'll know you're here. Share it with someone else who loves stories that leave the heart unable to rest. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now so you won't miss the stories still to come, because the best story may be the one you haven't heard yet. Dorothy Kade led Celeste down the long hallway of the mansion, the steady click of her high heels on the marble floor creating an echo like the measured counting of time. She was 78 years old, yet her back was straight as steel, her stride decisive, her sharp eyes sweeping across every dark corner without missing a single thing. Celeste followed behind, her old backpack slung over one shoulder, trying not to let her face reveal how overwhelmed she was by the enormous oil paintings hanging on the walls, the crystal chandeliers casting warm golden light over the thick, velvety Persian carpets, and the closed oak doors lining both sides of the corridor, as though they concealed hundreds of secrets she wasn't permitted to know. When they passed a half-open door near the end of the first-floor hallway, Dorothy suddenly stopped and motioned for Celeste to stay where she was. Inside the room, 3 men in black suits sat facing a large bed, leaning forward, their faces tight with strain. And on that bed, Elias Kade lay on his side, his gaunt frame swallowed by the wrinkled white sheets, yet his voice cut through the room like a sharpened blade. "Tell Volkov," he said, each word slow and clear enough to make the air around them seem to freeze solid, "that if his men cross Halstead again, I'll send them back in body bags. Now get out." The 3 men rose almost at once, bowed their heads without daring to look directly at him, and hurried from the room so quickly that Celeste had to press herself against the wall to avoid them. Their eyes flicked over her, cold, appraising, dangerous, and then they disappeared into the shadows at the end of the hall. Celeste stood there, her heart beating faster than usual, and for the first time since signing the contract, she truly understood where she had come. This wasn't a hospital. This wasn't a nursing home for the rich. This was the den of the most powerful Mafia family in Chicago, and the dying man on that bed could still make an entire room tremble, with nothing more than a few hoarse sentences from cracked lips. Dorothy watched Celeste's reaction with eyes that missed nothing, then gave a small nod as though Celeste had just passed a test she hadn't even known she was taking. She led her into the grand sitting room, where the fireplace was still burning though the night wasn't especially cold, and poured her a cup of tea from a porcelain set so delicate that Celeste was afraid she might crush it if she held it too tightly. "My grandson is still running everything from that sickbed," Dorothy said, her voice low and firm, like someone who had spent a lifetime giving orders. "But his strength is draining away day by day. The Volkov family has caught the scent of weakness and is pressing from every side. If Elias falls, this entire empire falls with him." She set down her teacup and looked straight into Celeste's eyes. "You'll be living with the people in this house. Priscilla, Elias's stepmother, his father's second wife, she's cold as ice and has always seen Elias as the obstacle standing between her son and power. Finley, Elias's younger half-brother, 25 years old, gentle, loyal, and truly devoted to his brother. And Bianca, Finn's wife, 24, beautiful, sweetly smiling, always saying exactly what other people want to hear." Dorothy paused for a beat, and her eyes darkened. "Keep your eyes open and your mouth shut, Miss Harlow. That's the only advice I'll give you for free." Celeste nodded, but there was something in Dorothy's tone that kept her from holding back the question. "How did you choose me?" "I'm only a nurse who got fired. No one in Chicago wants to hire me." Dorothy smiled. The first smile Celeste had seen on that lined face, and it wasn't warm at all. It was as sharp as a knife. "1 week before my lawyer found you, I went to the St. Catherine Clinic," she said. "I pretended to be a patient. I faked complicated chest pain symptoms that only a truly skilled doctor could tell were false. You examined me for less than 3 minutes, then looked straight into my eyes and said, 'You're not sick, but your blood pressure really is high. You should take your medication properly instead of coming here to test me.'" Dorothy leaned forward. "You weren't afraid to tell a stranger to her face that she was lying. My grandson needs exactly that kind of person beside him, not trembling nurses who do nothing but nod and then run the moment he raises his voice." Celeste held the teacup in her hands, feeling the warmth spread into her cold palms, and realized that the old woman sitting across from her wasn't only the grandmother of a Mafia boss. She was the one who had once held power before him, and her eyes, even at 78 years old, still looked straight through every mask people wore, as though those masks were made of glass. Oscar led Celeste down the first-floor hallway, the 42-year-old butler's footsteps steady and silent, as though he had long since learned how to move through this house without making the slightest sound. Oscar's face was expressionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead, and he didn't say a single word to Celeste from the moment Dorothy handed her over to him with the brief instruction, "Take her to my grandson's room." They stopped in front of a heavy oak door at the end of the corridor, and even before Oscar placed his hand on the knob, Celeste heard the crash of something breaking from inside, glass striking the wall and shattering across the floor, followed by a voice, rough and ragged but still powerful enough to cut through the thick wood. "For the last time, take that damn tray away." Oscar turned to look at Celeste, his face still unreadable, though something in his eyes flickered that felt like a warning left unspoken. Then he opened the door and stepped aside for her to enter. The smell hit her first, the scent of old sweat soaked into bed linens that hadn't been changed in days. The bitter trace of medicine drifting from dozens of pill bottles scattered carelessly across the bedside table. The stale, airless heaviness of a room sealed shut behind heavy velvet drapes drawn across every window, allowing not a single thread of light to enter. The room was large, the ceiling high, but the darkness and the damp, stale odor made it seem to shrink into a suffocating box, tightening itself around the person inside it. And that person was sitting on the edge of the bed, back bent, head lowered, both trembling hands resting on his knees. Celeste looked at Elias Kade, and it took her several seconds for her mind to make sense of what was in front of her, because nothing in the gaunt shadow seated there resembled the man she had once glimpsed in passing at the clinic a year before. No hair, no beard, cheekbones rising sharply beneath skin so pale and thin that she could see the blue veins running along his temples. Shoulders that had once been broad now slumped inward as though crushed beneath an invisible weight. And his wrists, exposed beneath the loose sleeves of his sleep shirt, were so thin that Celeste thought she could circle one with her fingers. But then he lifted his head, and those blue eyes looked straight at her. Celeste nearly stepped back, because those eyes didn't belong to a dying man. They were sharp, clear, and dangerous in the way a wolf locked inside a cage is still dangerous. Perhaps even more dangerous than when it runs free, because anger and contempt had been compressed into something denser, deeper, more lethal. He looked her over from head to toe, not with the gaze of a man assessing beauty, but with the gaze of someone assessing a threat, the instinct of a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by people who wanted him dead. "Another one," he said, his voice hoarse and tired, yet every word still carrying the weight of command. "My grandmother never knows when to quit." Celeste stood where she was, neither retreating nor advancing, keeping her face calm, even though inside her chest, her heart was beating faster than usual. "You look like you haven't eaten in 3 days, Elias continued, his blue eyes still fixed on her without blinking. "I'm guessing you need this job more than I need you." Celeste drew in a quiet breath, then answered in a calm, clear voice. "That's true. I do need the money, but that doesn't affect my competence." Something flickered through those blue eyes, so fast that Celeste wasn't sure she had really seen it. Maybe surprise, maybe interest, or maybe only candlelight shifting in his pupils. The nurses before her, she guessed, had probably lowered their heads, stumbled over apologies, tried to look sympathetic with wet eyes he despised. Celeste did none of that. She simply told the truth, and the truth, however bare it might be, was at least the one thing that didn't insult the dignity of the person hearing it. "Help me lie down," Elias said after a few seconds of silence, his voice losing some of its mockery, replaced instead by the raw exhaustion of a body that had endured far too much. "I can't even do that by myself anymore." "Pathetic, isn't it?" Celeste stepped to the bedside, set her backpack on the floor, and slid one arm behind his back. She could feel the ridge of his spine beneath the thin fabric. She could feel the weight of him settling against her shoulder as he tried to turn. She could feel his labored breath against her neck every time he moved. She eased him gently down onto the bed, pulled the blanket up to his chest, and while her hand smoothed the creases from the sheet, her eyes moved swiftly across the room, with the professional instinct carved deep into her bones. The bedding was damp and smelled stale. It clearly hadn't been changed in days. The medicine bottles on the nightstand were in disarray, and several were already expired. Not a single window had been opened. The air wasn't circulating at all, and Elias, the man lying beneath that thin blanket, needed to be bathed urgently, something any nurse would have recognized within seconds of standing near him. But Celeste said nothing. Not yet. She had only just arrived. He had only just learned her name, and if she wanted to change anything in this room, in this man's life, she needed him to trust her first, even if only a little, even if only enough that he wouldn't throw her out before sunrise. Elias closed his eyes, his breathing gradually evening out, though it still sounded heavy and strained, and Celeste stood there in the suffocating dark, looking at the most powerful man in Chicago curled into himself on a bed, far too large for the wasting body beneath its covers, and she knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who had seen too many patients standing on the edge, that something in this room wasn't right, something she couldn't yet name, but something her instincts had already marked in red ink, from the very first moment she breathed in that stale air thick with bitterness and medicine. Celeste pulled the velvet-upholstered chair from the corner of the room to the window, sat down in the darkness, and began to wait. She didn't go to the private room Dorothy had arranged for her on the staff floor, because the instincts of someone who had worked thousands of night shifts in hospitals told her that the first night was the most important night, the night when she needed to observe her patient, when no one was performing, when pain wasn't hidden behind the shell of pride, when the body told the truth that the mouth refused to admit during the day. And Elias Kade's body said a great deal that night. He began to toss and turn about an hour after closing his eyes. At first, the movements were small, a shoulder twisting, a leg drawing up, but they quickly became true restlessness beneath the damp sheets. Sweat broke across his forehead, soaking the pillow, and he began to groan, a low sound trapped in his throat as though even in delirium he was still trying not to let anyone hear his weakness. Celeste took a small notebook from her backpack, clipped a tiny flashlight to its cover, and began to write. 11:42, repeated turning, heavy sweating. 12:15, groaning, hands gripping the sheets tightly. 12:30, woke suddenly, asked for water, voice hoarse, almost soundless. She poured water from the pitcher on the bedside table, lifted the glass to his lips because his hands were shaking too badly to hold it himself, and watched him drink in small sips, eyes closed, breath uneven. Then he drifted back to sleep. But it wasn't peaceful sleep. It was the thin, nightmare-filled kind of sleep she had seen in far too many critically ill patients. 120, began talking in his sleep, words tangled, incoherent, most of them too faint for her to catch. But one word came through more clearly than all the rest. Mother. He called for his mother in the voice of the 7-year-old boy who had lost her. Not in the voice of the 36-year-old Mafia boss who made Chicago tremble, and Celeste felt something sharp and quick twist inside her chest, then pushed it aside the way she had done for the past 3 years whenever emotion threatened to break through the wall she had built around her heart. She kept writing. 2 o'clock. Severe abdominal pain, curling inward, loud groaning. 2:30. Full body trembling, cold sweat. She began drawing lines across the page, the vertical axis marking the severity of symptoms, the horizontal axis marking time. Small dots joined together into the first chart in the notebook that would later save the life of the man lying on that bed. The night stretched on as though it had no end, and Celeste sat still in the old velvet chair, writing, watching, pouring water, pulling the blanket back over him each time he kicked it away in his fevered sleep. And she didn't sleep for a single minute. Around 3 in the morning, when the room fell into a brief silence between waves of pain, Elias suddenly opened his eyes. Those blue eyes were no longer sharp with coldness. Now they were clouded with exhaustion. Yet they found her immediately in the dark, as though he had known all along that she was sitting there. "You're still here?" His voice wasn't irritated. It wasn't mocking. It was only pure surprise, the kind of surprise that belonged to someone who had forgotten what it felt like to have another person remain when night came. Celeste closed the notebook and rested the pen on her lap. "I'm still here." Silence stretched for a few seconds. Then he said, his voice tired but still carrying the tone of command. "Go to your room, Miss Harlow. I want to be alone." "That's an order." Celeste rose to her feet, slipped the notebook into her pocket, and lifted her backpack onto her shoulder. She walked to the door, placed her hand on the knob, then stopped without turning back. "Mr. Kade, when was the last time these bed sheets were changed?" There was no answer. She opened the door, stepped out, and closed it behind her with a soft click. Inside the dark room, Elias lay still, staring at the door that had just shut, and for the first time in 9 months, since the illness had begun devouring his life, someone had asked a question that no doctor, no nurse, and no servant had ever thought to ask. Celeste didn't sleep after leaving Elias's room. She returned to her own room, took a quick cold shower to stay alert, changed into clean clothes, then went down to the kitchen before anyone else in the mansion was awake. The kitchen was dark and silent at 5 o'clock in the morning, with only the steady hum of the industrial refrigerator filling the air, and Celeste searched through the spice cabinet until she found what she needed: dried mint, chamomile, and a few sprigs of lavender someone had forgotten in the back of the cabinet long ago. She slipped them all into her pocket and went back to the first floor, where Elias's room was still closed. She didn't knock. She opened the door quietly, stepped into the dim light, and began to work. First, the bed linens. She pulled loose each corner, rolled up the damp sheets heavy with the smell of sweat along with the pillowcases and the thin blanket, and stuffed everything into a large laundry bag she found in the linen closet at the end of the hall. In their place, she spread a fresh white set she had taken from the clean linen supply, pulling each corner tight with the practiced hands of someone who had changed thousands of hospital beds. Then she went to the windows, took hold of the edge of the heavy velvet curtains thick with dust, and pulled them hard to either side. Early morning light flooded into the room like water breaking through a dam, washing away the darkness that had ruled this place for weeks, perhaps months. Celeste opened the windows, and the October morning air swept in, carrying a faint chill and the scent of grass wet with dew from the garden below. She took out the herbs and placed them into a basin of warm water she had already prepared on the table by the window, and steam rose with the fragrance of mint, chamomile, and lavender, spreading through the room and slowly replacing the bitter medicinal odor and the damp staleness that had rooted itself into every thread of cloth and every seam of wood. She cleared the pile of medicine bottles from the bedside table, separating the ones that were still good from the ones that had expired, arranging them neatly in order. She wiped the floor around the bed and picked up the broken glass from the night before that no one had cleaned. And just as she set the second basin of herbs onto the windowsill, Elias opened his eyes. He lay still for a few seconds, his blue eyes blinking against the light he had refused for so many months. Then he looked around the room, and his face changed. Shock came first, swift and unmistakable, as though he had awakened somewhere entirely unfamiliar. Then anger followed at once, hot and fierce, making him try to sit up even though his body resisted every inch. "Who gave you permission to touch my room?" His voice was still hoarse, but much louder than it had been the night before, and Celeste realized that when Elias Kade was angry, he didn't shout. He lowered his voice, made it slower, and that restraint was what made him truly frightening. Celeste set the cloth down on the table, turned to face him, and answered in a voice so calm that the calm itself became the strongest shield she had. "A patient's room needs to be clean and ventilated. That is a basic medical standard, not a personal opinion. You can fire me, but you can't say I'm wrong." Elias opened his mouth, clearly to argue, but then he drew in a deep breath, the first breath in months in which his lungs didn't have to fight through thick, stale air, and he felt the difference immediately. His chest expanded, his shoulders lowered, and something in his rigid face softened, just a little, but enough for Celeste to notice. He didn't say another word about her taking it upon herself to clean the room. Celeste stepped closer, her tone still carrying the same unshakable professionalism. "I have a suggestion. Warm water with herbs will help ease the muscle pain and help you relax. You can already feel that the clean room makes it easier to breathe. Herbal water will help your body feel better in much the same way. Try it once. If it doesn't work, I won't ever suggest it again." Elias looked at her with the sharp, measuring gaze she was beginning to recognize. "One time," he said slowly. "If it wastes my time, you'll regret it." Oscar was summoned to help fill the large copper bathtub behind the folding screen in the room with warm water, and Celeste dropped the herbs in, stirring until the water turned a pale green, and the scent rose warm and rich into the air. When she helped Elias remove his sleeping shirt to prepare him for the bath, her hands stopped. Beneath the fabric, his gaunt body revealed a map of injuries she had not expected. Bruises everywhere, deep purple, yellowing, greenish, in different stages of healing, layered over one another like coats of paint on a portrait of suffering. Shallow cuts that had closed but still stood out in angry red lines. Large impact marks along his ribs, his shoulder, his hip. Celeste touched the largest bruise on the right side of his ribs with gentle fingers, and her fingertips trembled slightly, though she fought to keep still. Where did this come from? Elias didn't look at her. His eyes turned away, and his voice was flat when he answered. "Fainting. No warning. I hit furniture, the floor, whatever is near when it happens." She wanted to ask more, wanted to know how often he fainted, wanted to know why no one stayed with him at all times to prevent it, but she remembered his words from the night before, remembered that trust couldn't be forced, so she simply stored it away in her mind and helped him step into the bath. The moment his body sank into the warm herbal water, Celeste saw something that 9 months of illness and a dozen doctors had failed to give this man. His shoulders lowered, his jaw stopped clenching, his blue eyes closed not from exhaustion but from relief, and a sigh escaped from deep in his chest, long and slow, as though the pain had stepped back for the first time since it began taking over his body. Celeste told him he needed to soak for at least an hour for the herbs to do their work, then stepped outside and left Oscar to watch over him. 45 minutes later, Oscar came running out to find her with an expression so baffled it was almost funny. "Miss Harlow, he refuses to get out of the bathtub." In the end, Oscar did manage to persuade Elias to get out of the bathtub after nearly an hour and a half, far longer than the time Celeste had suggested. And when he was sitting on the bed with the fresh white sheets beneath him, wearing a clean bathrobe, his scalp still bare but noticeably more flushed with healthy color than the ashen gray of the night before, Oscar came in carrying the silver tray that had already been prepared downstairs in the kitchen. Celeste was standing by the window, checking the herbal basin once more when she heard the tray being set down on the table. She turned and saw the familiar breakfast she guessed Elias had been eating for months. Bacon, shining with grease, scrambled eggs gone stiff and dry, toast burned dark at the edges, and a cup of black coffee so strong it looked almost thick. She walked over and placed her hand on the edge of the tray before Oscar could slide it toward Elias. Leave that tray, Oscar. From today on, I'll be in charge of Mr. Kade's meals." Oscar looked at her with an expression Celeste couldn't quite read, half surprise and half something else she couldn't yet name. Then he said in his usual even tone, "He'll only eat bacon and eggs. Refuses everything else. We've tried." He either throws it up or shoves the tray away. Celeste didn't argue. She only said, "I understand." Then left the room, went downstairs to the kitchen, and spent 45 minutes preparing 2 bowls of nourishing porridge made from chicken bone broth, oats, fresh ginger, and a little honey, the kind of food she had cooked for hundreds of wasting patients at the hospital and had never once failed to keep down in the stomachs of people who couldn't keep anything else down. She carried the 2 bowls back upstairs on a small tray, set one in front of Elias, who was reclining against the headboard, and kept the other one in her own hands. Elias looked at the porridge, then at her, then back at the porridge. "Take it away," he said, his voice flat but final. "I'd rather starve than eat that." Celeste said nothing. She didn't persuade him. She didn't explain nutrition or digestion, or any of the things the nurses before her had most likely tried and failed to use. Instead, she pulled the familiar velvet chair over to face his bed, sat down, placed the second bowl in her lap, picked up the spoon, blew lightly on it to cool it, then lifted it to her mouth and ate. Slowly, calmly, 1 spoonful at a time. She blew on it, tasted it, chewed it, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone enjoying the best meal of the day. She wasn't pretending, because she truly was hungry after a sleepless night and a hard morning of cleaning, and the hot porridge fragrant with ginger and honey was exactly what she needed. The smell of it spread through the room that had just been cleansed with herbs, the rich scent of broth mingling with fresh ginger and the faint sweetness of honey, a warm, simple smell that called to mind family kitchens on winter mornings. Celeste didn't look at Elias. She only ate, and stayed silent, and waited. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 full minutes of silence in the room, broken only by the soft sound of the spoon touching the side of the bowl and the steady sound of Celeste swallowing. Then another sound shattered the stillness, a sound Elias Kade would certainly deny to his grave if anyone ever mentioned it again. It was the growl of his stomach, loud, clear, and impossible to hide no matter that he ruled all of Chicago. In the 5th minute, he spoke, his tone sharp but brief. "Give it here." Celeste set her spoon down, slid the untouched bowl at the edge of the bed toward him without a word, then went on eating her own. Elias picked up the spoon and brought it to his mouth with obvious reluctance, tasted it once, then again, then kept eating until the spoon scraped against the bottom of the empty bowl. He finished it all. No nausea, no pushing it away, no vomiting. For the first time in many months, food went into his stomach and stayed there in peace. He set the bowl down on the bedside table and said without looking at her, it was acceptable. Celeste stood, gathered the bowls onto the tray, walked to the door, and before stepping across the threshold, turned back and said softly, but clearly enough for him to hear, "Tomorrow I'll make it even better." Then she left, leaving Elias Kade sitting alone on the bed with its white sheets, still carrying the scent of sunlight, in a room full of morning light and herbal fragrance, his stomach warm, his body more at ease than it had been on any day in the past 9 months, and he looked at the door after it closed behind her, with an expression he didn't allow anyone in the world to see. That afternoon, Dorothy invited Celeste into the tea room on the 2nd floor, a smaller room than the main sitting room but decorated with quiet elegance, with white wicker furniture and glass doors overlooking the garden behind the mansion. When Celeste stepped inside, a young woman was already seated beside Dorothy, and she understood at once that this must be one of the faces Dorothy had warned her about the night before. Bianca Kade, 24 years old, Finn's wife. Celeste looked at her, and her first impression was perfection. The kind of perfection calculated down to the smallest detail. Glossy red hair fell in carefully shaped waves over her shoulders. A peach silk dress clung to her slender body. Delicate but costly jewelry glimmered at her wrist and throat, and a sweet smile spread across lips painted soft pink when she rose to greet Celeste. "It's lovely to meet you, Miss Harlow," Bianca said, her voice as smooth as silk, her green eyes meeting Celeste's with a friendliness anyone would have believed was sincere. "I heard you got Elias to take a bath this morning and finish an entire bowl of porridge. Quite impressive for someone who's been here less than a day." Celeste smiled politely and thanked her, but in the brief moment, Bianca turned to speak to Dorothy. Celeste caught something. Only for an instant, quick as a blink, Bianca's gaze moved over her from head to toe, then returned to her face with a cold, measuring judgment utterly different from the sweet smile still resting on her lips. It wasn't a look of contempt or curiosity. It was the look of someone weighing the danger of a new variable appearing in an equation she had been calculating for a very long time. Then it vanished, so quickly that Celeste wondered if she had imagined it. Bianca turned back with that same warm smile and began talking about the Chicago autumn weather as though nothing at all had happened. The tea room door opened again, and a young man stepped in with a long stride, confident but not arrogant. Finley Kade, Finn, 25 years old, Elias's younger half-brother. He was tall, lean, but solidly built, with the kind of handsome face that carried a softer, aristocratic grace, and honey-colored eyes that gave off a warmth Celeste felt from the very first second. Finn went straight to Dorothy and embraced her with a hug so tight and genuine that Celeste could see plainly it wasn't mere politeness. Then he turned to her and held out his hand with an open smile. "You must be Miss Harlow. I just stopped by Elias's room, and he looks much better already. The room is clean, bright, smells of herbs instead of bitter medicine. It's the first time in a very long while I've seen him not grimace when I walked in." Celeste shook Finn's hand and immediately felt the difference between husband and wife. Where Bianca had cool calculation hidden behind a sweet smile, Finn was filled with sincerity so unguarded it was almost naive. He turned to look at Bianca with absolute adoration, the kind of gaze only a man deeply in love could have, and said gently, "Darling, I have to go meet a partner in the South Side this afternoon. Do you want to come with me?" Bianca smiled, resting her hand on Finn's arm with perfect tenderness, and they left together, Finn looking at her as though she were the most precious thing in the world, while Bianca stared straight ahead, her mind clearly somewhere else. Dorothy let out a faint sigh after the door closed, and Celeste understood that Dorothy had seen that imbalance for a very long time and could do nothing about it. Celeste excused herself and left the tea room so she could go check on Elias before supper. And as she stepped into the second-floor hallway, a hand caught her arm from behind, not hard, but firmly enough to make her stop. Priscilla Kade stood there, 55 years old, tall, thin, platinum hair swept up, her face perfectly made up, but her gray eyes cold as steel. She didn't smile. She didn't greet her. She only looked Celeste over from head to toe with a contempt she didn't even bother to hide, then said in a low, precise voice, "You should know your place in this house, Miss Harlow. You are hired help. Don't ever forget that." Then she released Celeste's arm, turned her back, and walked away down the hallway, her high heels striking the stone floor in an even rhythm, the sound echoing like hammer blows driving the warning into place. Celeste stood still for a moment, watching Priscilla's figure disappear beyond the corner of the corridor, then drew in a deep breath and kept walking. In her mind, the three new faces arranged themselves into place beside everything Dorothy had told her. Bianca, with the sweet smile concealing cold eyes that measured and judged. Finn, with his open heart and his blind love for a wife he didn't truly understand. And Priscilla, with her undisguised contempt and her blunt threat spoken in broad daylight. 3 faces, 3 different signals, and Celeste stored them all carefully in her memory, the same way she had recorded Elias's symptoms in her small notebook, because she was beginning to feel that in this house, people needed diagnosing no less than disease. The days that followed brought small but steady changes, like drops of water slowly clearing a clouded lens. Elias was still irritable, still sharp-tongued whenever Celeste entered the room with a tray of food or a fresh basin of herbs, but the frequency of it had clearly lessened, and so had the force. He no longer threw things when she opened the curtains in the morning. He no longer snapped when she changed the bed linens each day. And sometimes, when she set a bowl of porridge in front of him, he would simply pick up the spoon and eat, without going through the familiar ritual of refusal first. Celeste prepared every one of Elias's meals with her own hands, going down to the kitchen at 5 o'clock each morning before the kitchen staff woke, choosing the ingredients, cooking the food, and carrying it upstairs to his room herself. And every day, Oscar appeared beside her in the kitchen or in the hallway, offering to help in a voice that was polite but persistent. "Miss Harlow, let me handle breakfast today. You were up during the night. You need rest." Or, "I can take his lunch upstairs. You don't have to do everything yourself." Each time, Celeste refused politely but firmly, saying that she wanted direct control over the exact nutrition Elias needed in each meal. And each time, she noticed Oscar's smile tighten just a little at the corners of his mouth before he nodded and withdrew. She filed that unusual persistence away in her mind, though she couldn't yet find any reasonable explanation for it other than the devotion of a butler who had served the Kade family for decades. Celeste's notebook grew thicker by the day. Each night she sat in the velvet chair in her room, the lamp casting light over pages crowded with notes, and she added new lines to her charts, connecting new dots into the growing chain of data she was building. Symptoms: time, severity of pain, frequency of vomiting, frequency of fainting, hours of sleep, hours awake, types of medicine, dosages. Everything was recorded with the precision of someone who believed that truth always hid inside numbers. If only a person knew how to look. No pattern had revealed itself yet, but the data was taking shape, and Celeste knew that if she had enough time, the numbers would tell her the story no doctor had managed to uncover. Finn visited his brother every evening, usually after 9 o'clock when the mansion began to grow quiet. One night, Celeste passed Elias's room on her way back to her own and heard the sound of reading through the slightly open door. Finn's warm, steady voice reading page after page from an old novel that seemed to have been loved by both brothers since childhood. She stopped for a few seconds, just long enough to hear Elias laugh softly. A small laugh, hoarse and brief, but still laughter, and Celeste found herself smiling before she even realized it. A few days later, when Priscilla stopped Celeste once again in the second-floor hallway, this time in front of 2 servants scrubbing the floor, and said in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear that some hired people seem to forget where they belong in this house, Finn suddenly appeared at the far end of the corridor. "Mother," he said, his voice still gentle but carrying a weight Celeste had never heard from him before. "Miss Harlow is helping Elias. He's noticeably better since she arrived. Please don't make things harder." Priscilla fell silent at once, her gray eyes flashing with anger for a brief second, but she said nothing more. She simply turned and walked away, and Celeste looked at Finn with a quiet gratitude for the young man who had dared to stand between her and his formidable mother. But the thing that changed the way Celeste saw Priscilla completely wasn't the threats or the contemptuous looks in daylight. It was what she happened to witness at 2 o'clock in the morning one night when she went downstairs to the kitchen for water. She pushed open the kitchen door and stopped right at the threshold. Priscilla was standing alone at the stove, her back more bent than it ever appeared during the day, her platinum hair loose instead of pinned into its flawless arrangement, a wrinkled nightrobe wrapped around her body, and she was stirring a small pot of porridge over a low flame. Not porridge for Elias, not for Finn, not for anyone at all except herself, because at 2 o'clock in the morning, in the empty kitchen of the mansion, Priscilla Kade couldn't sleep, and the only way she knew how to survive the long night was to cook something with the trembling hands she hid so carefully behind silk gloves during the day. Celeste looked at Priscilla's face in the pale yellow kitchen light and saw a completely different woman. There was no cold arrogance left, no lifted chin, no gray eyes sharp as steel. In their place was a deep weariness, fear hidden beneath layers of powder and pride. A mother watching the world around her shift and change without knowing where her son would be standing when the storm finally passed. Celeste stepped quietly back from the kitchen door, not disturbing her, and returned to her room with a glass of water taken from the hallway tap instead. But the image of Priscilla stirring porridge alone in the dark had carved itself into her mind, and from that night on, whenever Priscilla looked at her with contempt during the day, Celeste no longer saw only an enemy. She saw a frightened mother, and that fear, no matter how deeply it was wrapped in arrogance, was still the fear of a woman trying to protect the only child she had in this world. That morning, Celeste brought Elias's breakfast up to his room as usual, and immediately sensed that the atmosphere had changed completely. Oscar stood by the window with a face more strained than she had ever seen before. 2 bodyguards in black suits stood against the wall like stone figures, and on Elias's bedside table, resting on a square of black velvet, was a small wooden box that had already been opened. Inside lay a gleaming silver bullet, and engraved into its surface in sharp capital letters were 2 words: Elias Kade. Beside the box was a white card with a handwritten message: "We hear you're unwell. Happy to help the Kade family with a smooth transition." Celeste set the breakfast tray down on the table and stepped back into the corner of the room, instinct telling her that this wasn't the moment to speak or ask a single question. Elias lay on his side on the bed, his body still gaunt beneath the white sheets, but his blue eyes no longer looked clouded by exhaustion or softened by weariness the way she had seen before. They were blazing now, ice cold, and dangerous in a way that seemed to lower the temperature of the whole room. "Send Brennan in," he said, his voice low and slow, each word falling with the weight of lead. A broad-shouldered, middle-aged man stepped inside and bowed his head. Elias didn't sit up. He didn't need to, because his power didn't live in posture or physical presence. It lived in every syllable that left those cracked lips. "Volkov thinks I'm dying, so he dares send this childish little toy into my house," he said, his thin finger pointing toward the silver bullet without even looking at it. "Send this exact bullet back to Kane, along with the little finger of the man who brought it to my gate, and tell him that next time he wants to send a message, he should deliver it himself, if he still has the courage." Brennan nodded and left the room without a word. The two bodyguards followed, and the door shut behind them, leaving only Oscar, Celeste, and Elias in the room that smelled of herbs and that only minutes earlier had felt as peaceful as a hospital chamber. Celeste stood motionless in the corner, her heart beating faster though her face remained calm, and she looked at the man lying in that sickbed with entirely new eyes. This wasn't the patient she had helped lower onto the mattress, had held water to his lips, had heard call for his mother through delirium. This was Elias Kade, Mafia boss, a man who had just ordered someone's finger cut off in a voice calmer than the way most people ordered their morning coffee. And what made Celeste shiver wasn't the cruelty of what he had said, but the ease of it, as though violence were his first language, and he was only speaking the tongue his world understood best. Oscar left the room soon after, and when only the two of them remained, Elias turned his head toward Celeste, who was still standing in the corner, and the cold in his blue eyes began to fade, replaced by something closer to curiosity. "Are you afraid now, Miss Harlow?" Celeste drew in a slow breath, looked him straight in the eyes, and answered honestly, "No, but I understand why other people are." He studied her for another few seconds, his gaze searching, then softening, and he said nothing more, but Celeste noticed the slightest curve at the corner of his mouth, almost too faint to be seen, before he closed his eyes and let his head fall back against the pillow, as though that brief exchange had drained the last strength the anger had just forced into his body. Quietly, Celeste set the bowl of porridge on the bedside table, placed the silver bullet back into its box, and pushed it farther from his line of sight, then left the room. She walked down the first-floor hallway toward the kitchen, and when she turned the corner near the staircase, she stopped. Bianca was standing by the window at the far end of the hall, her phone pressed close to her ear, speaking in a whisper that Celeste couldn't make out clearly, but she could hear the tone, and that voice wasn't sweet or gentle the way it always was in public. It was low, quick, and carried something that sounded more like command than conversation. The instant Bianca realized someone was standing at the end of the hallway, she ended the call at once, so quickly that her finger nearly struck the screen, then turned back with her usual sweet smile. "Just calling my hairdresser," Bianca said lightly, waving a hand as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world, then swept past Celeste in a trace of expensive perfume. Celeste watched her disappear beyond the staircase, and in her mind, one more small question mark settled beside the others already there, not yet large enough to become suspicion, but sharp enough that she couldn't ignore it. That night, Celeste stopped by Elias's room at 10 o'clock, as had become her habit over the past several days, to check his medicine, change the water in the herbal basin, and make sure he had finished the dinner she had prepared. But when she opened the door, he wasn't in bed. Elias was sitting in the chair by the window, the one she had pulled there on the first night, the curtain drawn aside, and he was staring out into the darkness with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It wasn't pain. It wasn't anger. It was longing, pure and deep, the longing of a prisoner gazing out at the world through iron bars. He didn't turn his head when he heard her come in. He only said, in a voice gentler than usual, almost a whisper, "Miss Harlow, what's it like outside tonight? It's been a long time since I felt wind on my skin. I don't remember what it feels like anymore." Celeste stopped in the middle of the room, looking at him sitting there in the moonlight pouring through the glass, his shadow thin and frail against the wall like a charcoal sketch on white paper, and something in those words touched the very place she had spent 3 years trying to wall off inside herself. She looked out the window, at the garden below bathed in silver moonlight, then looked back at the wheelchair folded in the corner of the room, untouched since she had arrived, and an idea formed in her mind, bold and perhaps reckless, but she had stopped caring about reason the night she signed a contract with a Mafia family. She unfolded the wheelchair, wheeled it beside his chair, and said, "Get in." Elias looked at the wheelchair, then at her, and his blue eyes flashed with something like surprise mixed with resistance. "Miss Harlow, I have no intention of leaving this room in the middle of the night like some fugitive." But Celeste had begun to read him after more than a week under the same roof, and she knew that when Elias said no, sometimes what he meant was convince me, so she said gently but firmly, "There's an entire garden waiting for you outside. At this hour, everyone is asleep. Galde will see you. No one will judge you. No one will pity you. Just you, the night, and the flowers." He was silent for a long moment, looking out the window once more, then braced his hands on the chair and tried to rise. Celeste stepped forward to help him, her familiar arm sliding behind his back, and he lowered himself into the wheelchair without another word. She pushed him through the dark hallway, down the gentle ramp at the back entrance of the mansion, and out into the garden. The moment the night air touched his skin, Elias closed his eyes. He breathed in, deep and slow, his chest rising and falling, and on that gaunt, pale face, Celeste saw the thing she had been waiting for without ever knowing she was waiting for it. He smiled, not a mocking smile, not a bitter smile, a real smile, the smile of someone who had just been given back something precious he thought was lost forever. She pushed the wheelchair slowly along the white gravel path that wound through the garden, and Elias reached out to touch the roses blooming on either side, his thin fingers brushing lightly over petals wet with dew, then lifting them to his nose to breathe in the fragrance. When they reached the western corner of the garden, where a bed of lavender bloomed in vivid purple under the moonlight, Elias told her to stop. He looked at the flowers swaying gently in the night breeze, and when he spoke, his voice deepened with memory. "I planted this lavender bed," he said. "My mother loved lavender. She died when I was 7, but before that, every morning she would place a sprig of lavender beside my pillow before I woke up. I'd open my eyes and the sweet scent would be there to greet the day." He fell silent for a moment, his fingers still lightly touching the nearest bloom, then added in a lower voice, almost as though only he himself could hear it, "I had accepted that I was going to die. A dozen renowned physicians can't all be wrong at once. The only thing I'm afraid of isn't death." He turned his head and looked at Celeste, his blue eyes bright in the darkness. "I'm afraid of dying without anyone remembering that I was human. They'll only remember me as the boss, as Kade, as the name people feared or hated. No one will remember that I once planted flowers for my mother." Celeste stood behind the wheelchair, both hands resting on the handles, and she felt something burn behind her eyes that made her blink quickly several times to push it back. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but softer than usual. I'll remember you as the man who planted lavender for his mother." He didn't say anything. He only turned back to the lavender bed, and they remained there in silence for a long while, with only the sound of the wind, the chirp of crickets, and the scent of lavender wrapping around two lonely people in the midnight garden. Celeste pushed him back to his room when the moon had begun to tilt toward the west. She helped him into bed, pulled the blanket over him, and when she started to draw her hand away to leave, Elias caught her hand. He didn't grip it tightly. He only held it lightly, and his fingers were warmer than she expected. He looked at her for a few seconds that felt to Celeste like an entire minute, then let go, slowly, as though he had to force himself to do it. "Go to your room, Miss Harlow. You need sleep." Celeste stepped out and pulled the door closed, but when she looked back, she noticed it wasn't fully shut. He had left it slightly ajar, a narrow opening just wide enough for the hallway light to slip through, and Celeste understood that it wasn't carelessness. It was a signal, an unspoken invitation, telling her she could come in any time without knocking. She went back to her room and lay down, but couldn't sleep, and when she got up to go downstairs for water, she found Oscar standing in the hallway. He looked at her with an expression that was hard to read, then said quietly, "The master asked me about you, Miss Harlow. Asked about your family, your past. He's never asked about any of the nurses before." Celeste didn't answer. She only nodded and returned to her room, but her heart was beating a little faster, and she didn't know what to do with that feeling. And on the second floor, behind the curtain of a room overlooking the garden, a motionless figure had watched their entire midnight excursion from beginning to end. Bianca Kade lowered the curtain, her face sinking back into shadow, and stepped away into the room without making a single sound. The night after their walk in the garden, Celeste couldn't sleep. She lay on her bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about Elias's hand holding hers and then letting go, about the door left slightly open, about Oscar saying the master had asked about her, and she knew she was standing on a dangerous line between professionalism and something else she refused to name. So she decided to do the most useful thing she could do at midnight: read. The library on the second floor of the Kade mansion was a large room with oak shelves rising all the way to the ceiling, thousands of books arranged in perfect order, and a few leather chairs set near the fireplace. Celeste took 3 thick medical textbooks from the highest shelf, sat down in the chair by the window where the moonlight was bright enough to read without turning on a lamp, and began turning page after page in search of anything that might explain Elias's strange combination of symptoms. She had been reading for about half an hour when the sound of whispering near the fireplace made her lift her head. Priscilla and Bianca were sitting there, 2 shadows in the fading firelight, their heads bent close together, and Celeste didn't know whether they had been there all along or had just come in without her hearing them. Both women turned to look at her at the same moment, Priscilla with cold gray eyes, Bianca with the sweet smile. Celeste trusted less and less each day. "You stay up late, Miss Harlow," Bianca said softly, very diligent for a nurse. Priscilla leaned forward, the fire casting sharp shadows across her face. "I hope Dorothy knows you took her grandson out into the garden at night to breathe the cold air. His health is already fragile. If his condition worsens because of that careless little outing, I imagine Dorothy will want to know exactly who is responsible." The threat was as clear as the silver bullet in the wooden box that morning. They had seen it, they knew, and now they were making sure she understood that the information could be used against her whenever they wished. Celeste closed the book, stood up, said, "Good night, ladies," in the calmest voice she could gather, then left the library with the 3 heavy books in her arms and something heavier still in her chest. She walked down the second-floor hallway toward her room, opened the door, stepped inside, and stopped on the threshold. Something was wrong. Her small room looked almost exactly the same as it had when she left it, but almost was the most important word in that thought. The desk drawer sat slightly crooked to the left, instead of in the position where she always kept it. The coat hanging on the closet hook had turned a little to the right, instead of hanging straight. And her notebook, the notebook that held the symptom charts, the meal notes, the questions she had been asking about Elias's illness, was lying on top of the desk, neat and clean, but she remembered clearly putting it inside the drawer beneath a layer of clothes before she left. Someone had been in her room. Someone had opened the drawer, taken out the notebook, read every page, and then set it back on the desk. Perhaps deliberately so she would know, or perhaps in such haste that they forgot where it had originally been. Celeste's heart began pounding so hard and fast that she could hear it in her ears. Fear, real fear, the kind she hadn't truly felt since stepping into this mansion, rose inside her body for the first time, cold and sharp as a blade pressed against the back of her neck. But she didn't run. She picked up the notebook, slid it into the pocket of her coat, which from that moment on she intended to wear at all times, and decided that the notebook would not leave her body for another second. She sat down on the edge of the bed, trying to steady herself, and her eyes stopped on the glass of water on the bedside table, the glass she was certain she had drunk halfway before leaving, but which was now filled to the brim. Someone had poured out the old water and replaced it with fresh. Celeste picked up the glass, brought it to her nose, and caught a strange scent, faint and almost impossible to identify. Something herbal, but not any herb she knew, and her nursing instinct sounded an alarm in her mind before her conscious thoughts had time to catch up. She poured the water down the bathroom sink, watched it disappear into the drain, and from that night on, she drank only water she had drawn herself from the tap. She sat back down at the desk, opened one of the medical books, and tried to focus on the tiny lines of text beneath the desk lamp. But the fear and the exhaustion from too many nights of too little sleep finally won. She lowered her head onto the open page and fell asleep without realizing it. When she jerked awake, sunlight had already flooded through the window, and the clock read 9:45. Celeste had never overslept like that since the day she arrived at the Kade mansion. She ran up to Elias's room, opened the door, and found him sitting against the headboard with the familiar silver tray in front of him, loaded with greasy bacon and dry scrambled eggs, while Oscar stood beside the bed wearing an expression Celeste could only describe as satisfied. "Mr. Kade, I'm sorry for," Celeste began, but Elias cut her off without looking at her, his eyes fixed on the tray, his voice flat and colder, and more distant than it had been at any point since her arrival. "I can't wait forever on your goodwill, Miss Harlow. I don't need to wait for you." Celeste stood there, watching him eat the food she knew was bad for him, watching Oscar stand beside him with that unreadable face, and she understood that he wasn't angry because she had overslept. He was angry because she hadn't been there when he needed her, because he had opened the door for her, and she had failed to walk through it. The next 4 days were the longest 4 days since Celeste first stepped into the Kade mansion. Oscar took charge of every meal, bringing bacon and eggs with tireless regularity 3 times a day, and Elias hardly spoke to Celeste at all except for the bare minimum when she checked his medicine or changed the herbal water. His eyes always turned elsewhere whenever she entered the room, and the door to his room, the door he had once left slightly open for her after the night in the garden, was now shut tight. On the 4th night since Elias had stopped speaking to her, Celeste lay awake on the bed in her room, staring at the ceiling, and she knew she had to go check on him even if he didn't want to see her, because for the past 4 days he had eaten nothing but bacon and eggs brought by Oscar. For 4 days he hadn't had a single herbal bath. For 4 days she had only been allowed into his room long enough to set his medicine on the table and walk back out, and she could see the setback clearly in every small detail. His hands were trembling again, his face had turned paler, his eyes had grown duller, as though all the progress of the past 2 weeks was being erased in 4 short days. She put on her coat, slipped the notebook into her pocket out of habit, and walked down the dark hallway to Elias's room a little before midnight. The door was shut tight. She placed her hand on the knob, hesitated for 1 second, then opened it. Darkness hit her first, then the sound of groaning, low and broken, coming from the floor on the far side of the bed. Celeste rushed into the room, ran around the bed, and saw Elias curled on the hardwood floor between the bed and the window, both arms wrapped tightly around his stomach, knees drawn up to his chest, his whole body shaking, cold sweat soaking through his sleep shirt and dripping into a small puddle beneath his face, which was white as paper. "It hurts," he groaned through clenched teeth. His eyes squeezed shut, and his voice was no longer the voice of a Mafia boss or the voice of the proud man she had come to know. It was the voice of a creature being torn apart from the inside. "My stomach has never hurt like this. This time I'm really dying." Celeste dropped to her knees beside him, both knees hitting the cold wood, and her nursing instinct took over completely. She ran to the table, grabbed the pouch of herbs she always kept ready in his room, made tea with hot water from the thermos, her hands quick and steady even as her heart raced wildly. Then she came back, lifted his head from the floor, rested it in her lap, and brought the cup to his lips. "Drink, all of it, small sips." He drank, obedient because the pain was too great for him to resist, each small swallow passing through trembling lips, and she kept his head in her lap until the cup was empty. Then she slid her arm beneath his back, used every bit of strength in her thin body, made frail by 3 years of not eating enough, and lifted him, pulling him toward the bed, laying him down on the white sheets with the same care she would have given the most fragile life she had ever held in her hands. She pulled the blanket up to his chest, placed her hand on his forehead to check his temperature, and when she started to rise so she could sit in the familiar velvet chair, Elias's hand caught her wrist, not lightly, the way he had held her after the night in the garden. He gripped her hard, tight, desperate, like a drowning man clutching the only thing floating on the surface of the water. "Stay here," he said, his voice hoarse and breaking. "Sit here, beside me. I'm afraid that if I close my eyes now, I won't wake up again." Celeste sat down on the edge of the bed, and he didn't let go of her hand. The herbal tea began to work, the pain slowly easing, his jaw unclenching, his shoulders lowering, his breathing growing less ragged. He opened his eyes, those blue eyes wet with tears as they looked at her in the moonlight spilling through the window, and he spoke in a voice she had never heard from him before, stripped bare, without weapons, without walls. "I'm afraid to die, Celeste. This is the first time I've admitted that to anyone." Celeste, not Miss Harlow. The first time he had called her by name. She felt her name in his rough voice, as though it had been spoken for the first time in the world, carrying a weight and an intimacy no polite distance could hide. She placed her other hand against his face, brushing the sweat from his forehead, his temple, his sharp cheekbone, and he leaned into her palm as though it were the only shelter he had left. Then he drew her closer, slowly, gently, giving her enough time to pull away if she wanted to. She didn't pull away, and he kissed her, softly, trembling. His cracked lips touched hers, and Celeste tasted salt, not knowing whether it was his tears or hers or both of theirs. And the kiss wasn't a kiss of passion or hunger. It was the kiss of 2 people, standing at the edge of a cliff, one afraid of falling, the other afraid she wouldn't be able to hold on in time. "If I'm about to die," he whispered when their lips parted by only a few millimeters, his warm breath against her skin. "Then at least let me know what this feels like once." Celeste didn't answer with words. She stayed, all night. She sat beside him on the bed, her back against the headboard, his hand holding hers, his head resting near her shoulder, and she watched over every breath he took, until the herbal tea pulled him into the first deep sleep he had had in days. When he was finally asleep, Celeste gently stroked his shoulder, and her hand moved upward to the back of his neck, where the outline of hair had once been before illness had stolen it all, and beneath her fingertips, she felt them. Hundreds of new hairs, short and stiff, pushing up all across the back of his scalp like young grass breaking through the earth after a long winter. Her heart stopped for one beat. His hair was growing back, the hair of the man the medical board had said would never grow back because the illness had destroyed that part of him forever. His hair had begun to return during the 2 weeks she had cooked for him, and had worsened during the 4 days she had not. Celeste pulled the notebook from her coat pocket, turned to the chart page, and in the moonlight she saw the pattern she had been waiting for since the very first night emerge with a clarity that couldn't be denied. On the days she cooked for him, every symptom decreased. The lines on the chart went steadily down. On the days Oscar cooked, every symptom increased. The lines rose sharply upward. Not a single exception. Celeste stared at the chart, then at Elias, sleeping deeply on the bed, then at the food tray on the bedside table with the plate of bacon and eggs Oscar had brought up that afternoon, and the hand holding the notebook began to tremble, not from cold, but from the thing the numbers had just whispered in her ear. Something more terrifying than any silver bullet. Celeste lay beside Elias until his breathing turned deep and even, until his hand slowly loosened around hers in sleep. And she looked at his face in the moonlight, the face that had just kissed her, just spoken her name, just confessed his fear of death to her, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was no longer doing this because of a contract, no longer because of money, but because she loved this man, and she would not let anyone kill him. She slipped her hand gently from his, pulled the blanket higher over him, then took the tray from the bedside table, the plate of bacon and eggs Oscar had brought up that afternoon, of which Elias had managed to eat only half before the pain struck him down. She wrapped the remaining food in a clean cloth, tucked it into her coat pocket, and left the room without making a sound. The next morning, Celeste woke before everyone else, cooked breakfast for Elias with her own hands the way she had before, carried it upstairs, and placed it in front of him, without offering any explanation for her absence over the past 4 days. He looked at her for a long moment, then picked up the spoon and ate without saying a word, and Celeste accepted that as the only forgiveness he knew how to give. Then she went down into the garden. The gray stray cat she had noticed since her first day at the mansion still wandered near the kitchen door every morning, eating the scraps the staff threw outside. Celeste took the cloth from her pocket, opened it, and placed the small plate holding the bacon and eggs from Elias's dinner the night before in front of the cat. It sniffed, devoured the food greedily, then slipped away into the bushes. Celeste went back inside and waited. That afternoon, when she returned to the garden to check, the cat was lying curled beneath the oak tree near the southern fence, its small body trembling uncontrollably, a patch of vomit mixed with undigested food on the grass beside it, its eyes dull, its legs jerking in steady spasms. The symptoms were exactly Elias's, only reduced into a smaller body: vomiting, trembling, convulsions, loss of bodily control. Celeste knelt beside the cat, her hands shaking but her mind cold and clear, and she knew she was looking at living proof. No laboratory was needed. No blood test was needed. The cat had just told her the truth that a dozen leading minds had failed to uncover in 9 months. That night, when the mansion had gone quiet, Celeste went into the bathroom of her room, locked the door, and called Sister Monica at the St. Catherine Clinic. Her voice was low and fast as she described everything: Elias's symptoms over 9 months, the chart pattern with no exceptions between the days she cooked and the days Oscar cooked, the cat, and the strange smell in the food she couldn't identify. Sister Monica was silent for a long time on the other end of the line, so long that Celeste could clearly hear the clock hanging in her small bathroom ticking off every second. And then she said in a low, grave voice, "Bring me a sample of the food. But if this is what I think it is, you are living under the same roof as a murderer, Celeste." Celeste waited until 1 o'clock in the morning, when every light in the mansion had been extinguished and every footstep had ceased. then took the sample of Oscar's food that she had carefully preserved in a sealed container hidden beneath her bed, pulled on her coat, slipped out through the back door by the route she had studied in her first week, and drove the small car Dorothy provided for the staff through the Chicago night to St. Catherine. Sister Monica was waiting for her in the clinic, still wearing her white coat even though it was long past midnight, her face grave beneath the neon light. She took the food sample, separated each ingredient with the tools and knowledge of someone who had spent 40 years studying herbs and toxins. And after nearly an hour of meticulous work, she lifted her head and looked at Celeste with eyes Celeste had never seen on her before, eyes holding both anger and horror. "Black herb," Sister Monica said, pointing to tiny fragments she had separated from the layer of seasoning. "Black, almost invisible among the pepper and basil. A chronic poison, a small dose every day, building up gradually in the body over many months, causing vomiting, tremors in the hands and legs, hair loss, fainting, severe abdominal pain, and total physical wasting. If it isn't stopped, the victim will die within a few weeks to a few months, and no doctor will find the cause because the symptoms resemble dozens of different illnesses." She opened the medicine cabinet, took out a small bundle of dried herbs tied with string, and placed it in Celeste's hand. "The antidote. Mix it into water or food, 3 times a day. It will take several weeks to fully purge the poison that has built up in his body." Then she gripped Celeste's shoulder and looked straight into her eyes. "Who is doing this, Celeste?" Celeste looked down at the bundle of antidote in her hand, so small and light it was hard to believe it could reverse 9 months of poisoning, and she answered in a voice calmer than what she felt. "I don't know who's behind it yet, but I know who's putting the poison in." Celeste drove back to the mansion before dawn, the bundle of antidote tucked inside her coat against her chest, like a second heart beating in time with her real one. She went straight to Elias's room, opened the door, stepped inside, and locked it behind her with a small but decisive click. Elias was awake, lying on his side, and looking toward the window where the first light of the new day was beginning to fracture the horizon. And when he heard the lock turn, he looked back at her with an expression still carrying the remnants of the night before, of the kiss, of the confession, of the hand that had held on and not wanted to let go. But the moment he saw her face clearly in the pale gray light of dawn, everything soft in his eyes disappeared. She looked like someone who had run a marathon through the night, dark circles beneath her eyes, hair falling loose, lips pale. But her warm brown eyes were burning with something he recognized instantly, because he had seen it in the mirror for 20 years while ruling his empire. It was the certainty of someone holding a truth that could change everything. "What happened?" He sat up, his voice completely alert. Celeste pulled the velvet chair close to the bed, sat down facing him, and began to speak. She spoke in the voice of a nurse delivering a case report. Precise, logical, stripped of unnecessary emotion, each event placed in order. The chart in the notebook that she opened in front of him, the clean lines that couldn't be denied, the days she cooked and his symptoms eased, the days Oscar cooked and his symptoms worsened, not one exception in all the time she had been recording it. The stray cat eating the food Oscar had prepared, and then curling beneath the tree, vomiting and trembling with the same symptoms he had, only in smaller form. The drive through the night to St. Catherine, Sister Monica separating the black herb from the seasoning and confirming a chronic poison accumulated over many months that caused exactly the symptoms he had been suffering, and the bundle of antidote she took from her coat pocket and placed on the bedspread between them. Elias listened from beginning to end, without interrupting her once. His eyes widened little by little with every sentence Celeste spoke, and she could see the process of understanding moving across his face like a storm building over the sea, from stillness to ripples to full violence. When she finished, a crushing silence filled the room. Elias lifted a hand to the back of his neck, his palm moving slowly across his scalp, and she saw his eyes change when his fingers felt the new hair she had discovered the night before. Hundreds of short, stiff strands pushing through the skin of the scalp, the way his previous physicians had sworn it never would again. Then he raised both hands in front of him and looked at them, and Celeste looked too. His hands weren't shaking. They were completely still, because yesterday she had cooked breakfast for him. "I don't have a terminal illness," he said slowly, each word landing with the weight of stone. "I've been poisoned." And in that moment, Celeste witnessed a transformation she would never forget, as long as she lived. The gaunt sick man curled on the bed vanished. His blue eyes turned cold, colder than the silver bullet Volkov had sent, colder than marble floors at midnight, so cold that Celeste felt the temperature in the room drop even with the sun rising outside the window. His back straightened, his shoulders broadened, his jaw hardened. And Elias Kade, Mafia boss, woke from 9 months of forced hibernation, not with explosive rage, but with the deathly stillness of a man who had already decided exactly who would pay and how. "Call my grandmother up here," he said, and his voice was no longer hoarse but sharp and clear. "Right now." Dorothy arrived within 10 minutes, stepping into the room in slippers and a robe thrown on in haste, but her eyes were as alert as if she had never slept at all. Celeste told the whole story a second time, with the same chart, the same evidence, the same bundle of antidote lying on the bedspread. Dorothy listened, and Celeste watched her cry, for the first time since she had known this woman of steel, tears running down the deep lines of her cheeks like water through stone, but she made no sound. Then she wiped the tears away with the back of her hand, folded the handkerchief and slipped it into her pocket, and when she lifted her head again, Celeste saw a completely different woman. Dorothy Kade, former queen of the family, had awakened. Her eyes were sharp as surgical blades, her back straight as a hammer handle, and her voice did not tremble at all when she spoke. "We will deal with this, the Kade way." The three of them sat in the room filled with morning light and the scent of herbs, making a plan with the precision of people who understood that one small mistake could alert the hidden enemy and cause the evidence to vanish, or worse, cause the dose to increase. Elias would continue pretending to be gravely ill, performing every wave of pain, every groan, every tremor in his hands, in front of everyone except Celeste and Dorothy. Celeste would begin giving him the antidote 3 times a day, mixed into the herbal tea that only she prepared and only he would drink. Oscar would continue bringing food to the room at every meal, and Elias would pretend to eat it, then hide the food so Celeste could dispose of it afterward. And Dorothy would contact the 5 guards she trusted most, men who had served the Kade family since the years when she herself held power, and they would come disguised as new staff, a groundskeeper, a kitchen assistant, a driver, household help, and their one duty would be to watch Oscar everywhere he went until he led them straight to the person hiding in the shadows of that house. In the days that followed, the Kade mansion became the stage for a performance whose script was known to only 3 people. Elias acted with a skill Celeste would never have expected a mafia boss to possess. Every time Oscar entered the room carrying a tray of food, Elias groaned at exactly the right moment, twisted his face in pain, at exactly the right place, let both hands tremble when lifting a glass of water with the precision of an actor who had rehearsed thoroughly, and allowed his voice to grow weaker with each passing day, just as a man drawing closer to the death 12 doctors had predicted would sound. But once the door closed, and only Celeste remained in the room, Elias Kade became someone entirely different. The antidote Celeste mixed into his herbal tea 3 times a day was purging his body with astonishing speed. On the 3rd day after he began taking it, he sat up on his own without anyone helping him. On the 5th day, he stood on both feet beside the bed, one hand gripping the bedpost. But he didn't fall. On the 7th day, he walked from the bed to the window and back, slowly and with a faint tremor, but entirely under his own power, and Celeste stood beside him watching with wet eyes she hid by turning away to wipe down the bookshelf. His hair began growing back so quickly that it became a problem. A short, dark, bristling layer covered his scalp in less than 2 weeks, and stubble began to appear along his chin and cheeks, dark enough that if anyone saw it, they would know at once that his body was recovering in a way no terminal illness could explain. Every night, after the mansion had fallen asleep, Celeste sat beside Elias in the velvet chair by the bed, holding a razor, carefully shaving away each strand of beard, each new sprout of hair on his head beneath the flickering gold light of a candle, their faces close together in an intimate silence no one in that house was allowed to know existed. One evening, just after Celeste finished her false bedside vigil and stepped out into the hallway, she found Finn walking in with an old photo album tucked under his arm. He smiled at her with that familiar, warm smile, then stepped into his brother's room. Celeste didn't leave right away. She stayed outside the half-open door and listened, because she needed to know what Finn said when he believed only the 2 brothers were there. Finn sat beside the bed, opened the album, and began turning the pages. "Do you remember this?" he said, his voice touched with both joy and sorrow. "This was the day you taught me to ride a bicycle. I fell 10 times. You picked me up all 10 times without getting angry once." The sound of another page turning, and this one, My 10th birthday. You bought me a stuffed dog bigger than I was. Mother Priscilla nearly fainted because it took over the whole sitting room. Finn laughed softly, then went quiet for a long moment. Elias, he said, his voice lowering, trembling faintly. When my son is born, I'm going to name him after you, little Elias, so he'll know his uncle was the best man I've ever known. Celeste stood outside in the hallway, her hand gripping the doorframe, and she could feel Elias's pain through the wall as he lay there, pretending to be weak, pretending to be dying, while his brother, the one he loved, cried beside his bed and made the most sincere promises of his life. And Elias still didn't know whether Finn was involved, still didn't know whether that gentle younger brother was a traitor or another victim, and that not knowing tortured him more than any poison ever had. The next day, Bianca came to visit Elias with a basket of fresh flowers and a radiant smile. She stepped into the room, set the flowers on the table, asked after his health in a sweet voice full of perfect concern, but Celeste was standing in the corner of the room, and this time she knew what to watch for. The instant Bianca crossed the threshold, in that first split second before the smile had time to bloom on her lips, her eyes flicked quickly toward Oscar, who was standing by the medicine cabinet, and Oscar looked back. It lasted only a fraction of a second, almost impossible to notice unless someone was watching closely. But Celeste was watching closely, and she saw the tiny nod Oscar gave Bianca, so slight it was nearly invisible, confirming something only the two of them understood. That evening, during the family dinner Elias missed as usual, Bianca rose from her chair in the middle of the meal, placed a hand over her still flat stomach, and announced with a glowing smile of happiness that she was 2 months pregnant. Finn threw his arms around his wife, his eyes shining with joy. Dorothy forced herself to smile, though her eyes darkened, and Priscilla gave a small nod of congratulations with the same unreadable expression she always wore. Celeste sat at the far end of the table in silence, watching, noting everything. The next morning, Dorothy summoned Celeste into her private room, her face more tense than usual. She placed a large envelope on the table. Inside were photographs of the Kade mansion taken from several angles through a telephoto lens, sharp enough to make out the numbers on the license plates of the cars parked in the courtyard. Tucked in with them was a handwritten note from Kane Volkov. "We know which room he sleeps in." Dorothy looked at Celeste, her eyes cold and sharp. "Volkov doesn't have the ability to get photographs this detailed from outside the walls. Someone inside this house is feeding him internal information." Celeste looked at the photographs, then at Dorothy, and in her mind the final 2 pieces slid into place with a clear click. Bianca making secret phone calls in the hallway and ending them the moment she was seen. Volkov knowing details only someone inside the house could know. Bianca and Volkov. Celeste didn't say it aloud yet, because she still didn't have direct proof, still had nothing except 2 separate points she was connecting with. A line that might be true or might be wrong, and in the Mafia world, accusing the wrong person could be worse than accusing no one at all. But that line was growing darker and clearer, and Celeste knew that all it would take was one more point, one more moment, Oscar leading them to the right door at the right time, and everything would collapse like dominoes. The 3rd point appeared on the 12th night since the plan had begun. Celeste was sitting in Elias's room close to midnight, shaving the new beard growth from his chin by candlelight, as that habit had become a secret ritual between them, when 3 soft but urgent knocks sounded at the door. Elias signaled for her to open it, and one of the 5 guards, disguised as a groundskeeper, stepped inside, his face tight beneath a sheen of sweat. "Sir, Oscar just left his room." He went up to the 3rd floor, East Wing, the abandoned rooms. A 2nd person was already in there waiting for him. "I left 2 men outside the door." Elias rose from the chair, and Celeste saw the transformation happen in less than a second, from the patient sitting quietly, while she shaved him to the boss, standing straight with blue eyes turned cold as tempered steel. He looked at her and didn't ask whether she wanted to come, because he already knew the answer. He simply held out his hand, and she took that warm, steady hand without a moment of hesitation. They moved through the dark hallway on the 1st floor, up the staircase to the 2nd, then continued to the 3rd, where the sparse lighting and the dust lying over the carpet showed how rarely anyone came to this part of the house. Their footsteps were as light as possible on the old wooden floor, and the closer they came to the last room at the end of the East Wing, the more clearly Celeste could hear voices through the thin wooden door. 2 voices, one of them Oscar's, which she recognized at once, and the second voice made Elias stop in the middle of the hallway, as though someone had struck him in the chest. Celeste quickly pulled out her phone and pressed the record button, capturing every chilling word through the thin wood. Not Priscilla, not Finn. A woman's voice, young, and so familiar that both Celeste and Elias recognized it within the first half-second, yet completely different from any way they had ever heard it before, because that voice wasn't sweet, wasn't soft, wasn't gentle. It was low, sharp, and cold as a blade at the throat. "How much did he eat today?" Bianca asked. "Almost the entire plate, ma'am," Oscar replied. "Good. Increase the dose. I want this finished in 2 more weeks. That little nurse has started slowing things down. But now he's eating your food again. We can't miss this chance." There was the rustle of paper. Then Bianca continued, her voice carrying the rhythm of someone reading aloud a plan she knew by heart. "The baby in my belly will be the only true heir of the Kade family. Finn will become boss when Elias is gone, and I'll be the one who truly holds power behind him." Silence stretched for a beat. Then she added, her voice dropping lower, though Celeste could still hear every word through the thin door. "Volkov agreed. Once Finn rises, I'll give up the south side in exchange for protection during the transition. Kane is very pleased with the arrangement." Celeste felt Elias's hand tighten around hers hard enough to hurt, and she tightened her grip back. Not because of the pain, but because she understood that in this moment he needed to know she was there, that he wasn't facing alone the truth now ripping apart everything he had believed. A double betrayal, not only poisoning him for 9 months, but selling the family to the enemy as well, giving away territory that 3 generations of Kades had bled to hold, trading it for protection of a throne Bianca meant to steal with poison and a sweet smile. Elias released Celeste's hand, stepped in front of the door, and kicked it hard. The wood slammed against the wall with a crash that echoed through the 3rd floor. The single candle in the room flared wildly, and the 2 figures inside froze in that first instant. Oscar went white, his back flattening against the wall, eyes wide with terror like a rabbit caught in the headlights of a truck barreling straight toward it. And he began to shake, truly shake, not the way Elias had pretended to shake for the past 2 weeks. But Bianca didn't. She stood in the middle of the room, still holding her phone, her red hair loose over the shoulders of her silk nightgown. And on that flawlessly beautiful face, there wasn't a trace of fear, only anger, pure and fierce, anger at being caught, rather than at being discovered in wrongdoing, because in those green eyes, Celeste couldn't find a single gram of remorse. "You," Bianca said, staring at Elias standing solidly in the doorway, tall, straight-backed, blue eyes burning, looking stronger than he had at any point in the past 9 months, and the truth hit her like icy water. He wasn't dying. He had known. Everything had failed. Bianca turned toward Oscar, and the look she gave him then was what truly made Celeste shiver. Because it wasn't the look of a victim, or even an accomplice. It was the look of a mastermind staring at a servant who had failed her. "Useless fool," she said, the 2 words light as air but packed with contempt all the way to the bone. Elias stepped into the room, Celeste behind him, and the 2 guards appeared from either side of the hallway to block every escape. He looked at Bianca, and the only question that left his lips carried the weight of the whole world. "Does Finn know?" Bianca laughed, a short, cold sound that rang through the abandoned, dust-covered room like broken glass scattering over stone. "Finn? Finn loves you so stupidly it's pathetic. He cries over you every night. He doesn't know what seasoning I put in the food, much less what I'm doing. He's nothing but my obedient puppet, loving me blindly, doing everything I tell him while thinking it's his own idea." And in that moment, Celeste saw 2 opposite things exist on Elias's face at once. Relief, deep and real, because Finn was innocent, because his brother hadn't betrayed him, because Finn's love for him was true, and pain, just as deep, because his brother had married a snake, because Finn loved the woman who had been killing him, because the baby in Bianca's womb was his blood, carrying half the blood of the enemy. The guards dragged Bianca and Oscar down to the great sitting room on the 1st floor, both of their hands bound behind their backs with black plastic ties, and the heavy sound of footsteps on the staircase echoed through the mansion in the middle of the night, waking everyone in the house. Lights came on one by one along the hallways. Bedroom doors opened one after another. The startled, sleep-heavy faces of servants appeared in the gaps, staring wide-eyed at the procession passing before them, unable to understand what was happening. When Bianca was led through the 2nd floor hallway, Finn's shout tore through what little silence remained. He ran out from his bedroom, hair disheveled, bare feet on the cold stone floor, honey-colored eyes wild with panic, when he saw his wife with her hands bound between two large guards. "Bianca, my love, what is happening? Why are they tying your hands?" He lunged forward, trying to seize his wife's arm, but a guard blocked him, and Finn turned toward Elias, who was standing at the head of the staircase with Celeste beside him. His eyes were full of the desperate confusion of a man who did not possess a single piece of the puzzle needed to make sense of the picture opening before him. "Elias, you're standing. You're well. Why? What is?" The words spilled out in broken fragments, and Elias looked at his brother with a pain Celeste knew ran deeper than 9 months of poisoning. They gathered in the great sitting room, the crystal chandelier burning with brilliant light overhead. The fireplace had gone cold, but no one felt chilled, because the air in the room was thick with tension and fear. Bianca stood in the middle of the room, her hands bound behind her back, red hair loose and disordered, silk nightgown wrinkled. Yet her spine remained straight, and her eyes remained cold, as though she were attending a cocktail party instead of being caught poisoning her brother-in-law. Oscar knelt in the corner, head bowed, shoulders shaking, tears running soundlessly down his face, the exact opposite of the mastermind he had been serving. Dorothy stepped into the center of the room, and when she opened her mouth, her voice carried through the entire room with the clarity and authority of a woman who had once ruled every person standing there, before any of them even knew what power was. She told everything, from the beginning. She left nothing out. 9 months of systematic poisoning with black herb mixed into the seasoning of Elias's food. Oscar had been the one placing the poison there on Bianca's orders. Celeste had discovered it through her symptom charts and the experiment with the stray cat. Sister Monica at St. Catherine had confirmed the poison. The antidote had been given for the past 2 weeks, and Elias was making a full recovery. And Bianca had secretly contacted the Volkov family, promising to surrender the Southside territory in exchange for protection during the transfer of power once Elias died, and Finn rose in his place. Each truth fell like another brick, building a wall between Finn and the world he thought he had been living in. Finn stood in the middle of the room, his eyes fixed on Bianca the entire time Dorothy spoke, and Celeste could see what he was waiting for his wife to deny it, waiting for her to say it was a misunderstanding, a lie, a trap someone had set for her, waiting for the familiar sweet smile and the words, "It wasn't me, my love," the words he needed more than he needed air. Bianca looked back at Finn, and she said nothing. No denial, no explanation, no apology. Not one tear appeared in those green eyes. There was only the cold silence of someone who saw no reason to waste energy pretending now that the game was over. And that silence destroyed Finn more completely than any confession could have done. He collapsed to his knees on the marble floor, not falling, but caving in, like a building whose foundation had been ripped away. His arms hanging uselessly at his sides, his eyes open but seeing nothing. And he didn't cry. It was far worse than crying. He froze. His whole body, his whole face, his whole soul froze, as though someone had pressed pause on his life and forgotten ever to press play again. The warm, sincere man who loved his brother, loved his wife, carried photo albums to a bedside, read aloud every night, promised to name his son after his brother, defended a stranger nurse against his own mother. That man had just been betrayed by the person he trusted most, loved most, had given his whole life to, and the betrayal wasn't an affair or an ordinary deception. It was attempted murder. It was selling out the family. It was turning him into a puppet in a play designed to kill his own brother. Elias stepped forward, dropped to his knees beside Finn on the cold marble floor, and pulled his brother into his arms. He held him tightly. Those arms that 2 weeks earlier hadn't even had the strength to lift a glass of water now wrapping around his brother's shoulders with the force of a man returned from the dead. "I know you didn't know," Elias said against Finn's ear, his voice rough and breaking. "I never, not for 1 second, doubted you, Finn." Finn spoke, his voice hollow as the abandoned room on the 3rd floor where the truth had just been exposed. "I promised I would name my son after you. I sat and read to you every night. I didn't know any of it. I didn't know anything." And in the corner of the sitting room, standing apart from everyone else, Priscilla Kade looked at her son kneeling on the floor, shattered, and Celeste saw on the face of that cold woman the one thing no powder, no painted elegance, no disdainful posture could hide. The pain of a mother watching her child break into pieces while being powerless to stop it. And she, the woman who had threatened Celeste in the hallway, who had looked down on her in front of the servants, who had been hard as steel for so many weeks, stood there innocent, completely innocent. And that innocence offered her no comfort at all. After everyone dispersed, after Bianca and Oscar were taken by the guards to 2 separate rooms in the basement and locked in from the outside, after Dorothy led Finn back to his room in a state that was almost soulless, and Priscilla followed behind with the heaviest footsteps Celeste had ever heard from that woman, after the mansion slowly sank back into silence, though it was a silence entirely different from before, heavier, denser, like the air after a storm when everything has been torn apart and nothing has yet been mended, Celeste realized Elias was gone. He wasn't in his bedroom. He wasn't in his study. He wasn't in the sitting room where the crystal chandelier still blazed uselessly over the marble floor where Finn had just collapsed to his knees. Celeste went looking for him by instinct, her steps carrying her through the back door and down the gentle slope into the garden. And she knew where he was before her eyes found him, because there was only one place in that entire vast mansion where Elias Kade went when he needed to be himself, rather than the boss, rather than the brother, rather than Dorothy's grandson. Only Elias, the man who planted lavender for his mother. He was sitting on the stone bench beneath the oak tree beside the lavender bed, the very place where she had pushed his wheelchair that first night into the garden. But this time, there was no wheelchair. He had walked out here on his own 2 feet, and he sat there alone at 3 o'clock in the morning, his back slightly bent, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together in front of him, staring into the empty distance without truly seeing anything at all. Celeste didn't call his name. She didn't ask whether he was all right. She didn't speak any of the hundreds of hollow, comforting phrases the world had taught her to say to people in pain. She simply sat down beside him on the stone bench, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched but didn't, and stayed silent. The night wind carried the scent of lavender over them, cool and light, and Celeste sat there waiting, because she understood, through the experience of someone who had lost everything and had to build herself back from ashes, that sometimes the only meaningful thing one person can do for another is be there, not speaking, not asking, not judging, simply be there. 5 minutes passed, 10 minutes. The crickets sang in an even rhythm, like the heartbeat of the garden. Then Elias spoke, his voice hoarse and cracked in places Celeste had never heard it crack before. Not even on the night he was curled on the floor in agony. Not even when he admitted he was afraid to die. "I almost died," he said, each word leaving him slowly and heavily. Not because of illness, not because of fate, because a 24-year-old girl wanted to wear a crown. Silence, wind, lavender swaying. Finn will never fully recover from this. I looked at his face tonight, and I saw that something inside him had died. The part that trusted people. The part that loved people. The part he used to look at the world and believe it was good. Bianca killed that part. His voice cracked further. The baby in her womb is my blood, my nephew, Finn's child. But the mother is the woman who wanted to kill me and sell my family to the enemy. What am I supposed to do with a truth like that? Celeste sat beside him, listening to every word, feeling every fracture in the voice of the man she had kissed only the night before, in the dark room filled with the scent of herbs, and she knew there was no answer she could give him now that wouldn't turn into a lie. So she said the only thing that was true. I hate the phrase "everything will be all right" too. People said that to me when my husband died. Elias turned to look at her, his blue eyes faintly wet in the darkness, and Celeste knew it was time. The moment when she opened the door she had kept shut for 3 years and let him look inside, because he had just let her look inside him, and the only fairness possible between the 2 people sitting side by side in this midnight garden was equal vulnerability. My husband was a firefighter, she began, her voice soft but not shaking, because she had lived with this pain long enough to know how to carry it without letting it crush her, even though it had never grown lighter. He died in a warehouse fire 3 years ago. I was 4 months pregnant when I got the news. She paused, drew in a breath, and the rest came out like water slipping through a crack she no longer had the strength to seal. Shock. I miscarried in the hospital, lost my husband and my baby in the same week. Silence. The wind blew harder, and the lavender bent with it. That night I lay alone in a hospital room, my womb empty, holding the little baby shirt I had already bought, pale yellow, a duck stitched on the chest. I bought it the week before because I saw it in a shop window and thought my baby would look beautiful wearing it. Her voice still didn't shake, but tears slid down her cheeks in silence. without sobbing, only water, warm and salty, falling onto the hands resting on her knees. I lay there holding that shirt all night, and the next morning I had to get up, because there was no one coming to lift me. Elias said nothing. He didn't say I'm sorry, or I understand, or any of the things people say when they are standing before someone else's grief and don't know what to do. He simply lifted his arm, wrapped it around her shoulders, and drew her gently against him. Celeste let her head rest on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his body through the thin fabric, hearing the steady beat of his heart by her ear, and she closed her eyes. The two of them sat there in the midnight garden, among the lavender, beneath the star-filled sky of suburban Chicago, sharing wounds that needed no bandages, no explanation, no promises that tomorrow would be better, because both of them knew that some wounds never fully heal. They simply become part of the person who carries them, and the only thing that makes them hurt less isn't time or comfort, but having someone sit beside you in silence and understand, truly understand, how heavy that pain really is. The next morning, as sunlight poured through the windows of the great sitting room and fell across the exhausted faces worn down by the longest night in the history of the Kade mansion, Elias stood in the center of the room and announced his decision before the entire family and every staff member present. He stood straight, shoulders broad, blue eyes blazing, and though his head was still shaved and his body still leaner than it had been in his strongest years, no one in that room could look at him and think this was a man on the verge of death. The boss had returned, and the boss had a verdict to deliver. "Bianca and Oscar will be handed over to the law," he said, his voice carrying through the room without needing to rise. "They will not be dealt with our way. They will be dealt with by the law. The evidence is complete. Testimony from the guards who witnessed the secret meeting, a recording of the conversation between Bianca and Oscar, food samples containing the poison that have been confirmed by an expert, and the symptom charts matched against the timeline of the poisoning. All of it will be submitted to the prosecutor." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room, and Celeste saw Bianca standing between two guards, her hands still bound behind her back, a cold smile spreading across her lips. "You think the law can hold me, Elias?" Elias looked at her with blue eyes as flat and still as the surface of a frozen lake. "No, but I can." 2 short words, but they carried the full weight of the entire Kade empire, and the smile vanished from Bianca's mouth. The guards led Bianca and Oscar out of the room, and Elias turned toward Finn. His younger brother was sitting on the sofa, in the exact place where he had sat all through the night without moving, staring into empty space, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides like a man talking in his sleep. "Finn," Elias said, and his voice softened completely from what it had been moments before, and Celeste heard in it the voice of a brother rather than the voice of a boss. "You won't be held responsible because you're innocent. I'm arranging for you to go to Montana, to the ranch Father bought for family summers. You need time, space, and quiet to heal, however long it takes. I'll wait for you." Finn didn't react. He didn't nod. He didn't speak. He only sat there with honey-colored eyes that had lost all their light, and Dorothy placed her hand on the shoulder of her younger grandson, gave it a gentle squeeze, then led him out of the room with the slow steps of 2 people carrying the same wound. Elias turned to Priscilla. She had been standing in the corner of the room from the night before until now, still in her wrinkled robe, platinum hair loose, no makeup, no powder, no armor of any kind left to protect her, and when Elias looked at her, Celeste saw her shrink inward as though waiting for the blow to fall, waiting to be punished, waiting to be cast out of the house she had lived in for more than 20 years. "Priscilla," Elias said, and she closed her eyes as though bracing herself to hear a sentence passed. "You knew nothing about this. You're innocent." She opened her eyes and looked at him, unable to believe what she had heard. "You may stay here if you wish. This is still your home." And Priscilla Kade, the woman of steel who had threatened Celeste in the hallway, who had looked down on her in front of the servants, who had been cold as ice for so many weeks, the woman Celeste had once seen cooking porridge alone at 2 a.m. with trembling hands, began to cry. For the first time in front of Elias, tears ran down her bare face, her shoulders shaking, and she cried not from fear, but because she had never imagined that her husband's stepson, the man she had treated with coldness for so many years, would forgive her when he had every reason not to. Elias turned to Dorothy. "The baby Bianca is carrying," he said, his voice firm and clear. "When that child is born, I'll make sure it is given the best care possible. Doctors, caretakers, everything it needs. It is my nephew, Finn's child. None of this is the baby's fault." Dorothy nodded, her eyes bright as she looked at her grandson, and Celeste realized she was seeing exactly the man Dorothy herself had raised, fair, strong, and merciful when mercy was called for. Then Dorothy rose to her feet, took out her phone, and made a single call. She spoke briefly, in a voice of cooled steel that was still razor-sharp. "Kane, the traitor inside my house has been caught. Every arrangement she promised you is void. The Kade family is not weakened. Don't try again." She ended the call without waiting for a reply, set the phone down on the table, and looked at Elias, with the first smile Celeste had seen on her face since the night the truth came into the open. That afternoon, the Kade mansion was quiet in a way it had never been quiet since Celeste first stepped inside. Not the suffocating silence of secrets and sickness, but the silence of a house that had survived a storm and was learning how to breathe again. Bianca and Oscar had been taken away at dawn. Finn left the mansion at noon in the car Dorothy had arranged to send him to Montana, his eyes still hollow, but his hand gripping the small backpack Elias had slipped a family photo album into without a word. And Priscilla had withdrawn to her room after embracing Finn at the door. She held her son longer than any embrace Celeste had ever seen from her, and when she finally let him go, her eyes were red, but she didn't cry in front of him. She kept the tears until her bedroom door closed behind her. Celeste sat in the second-floor library, the same place she had come on so many sleepless nights to read medical books in search of answers for the mysterious illness that now was mysterious no longer. She sat in the leather chair by the tall window, October afternoon light passing through the glass and falling over the open book in her lap, over her small, slender hands still marked with the calluses of someone who had worked too much and eaten too little for 3 years, over the dark brown hair that had fallen loose across her shoulders because she was too exhausted to pin it back again after the longest night of her life. She wasn't truly reading. Her eyes moved across the words, but her mind was elsewhere, thinking of Finn on the road to Montana, of the unborn child, of Elias sitting alone in the garden at 3 a.m, of his hand pulling her gently against his shoulder, of the scent of lavender, of everything that had happened since the night she walked through the iron gates of this estate, with an old backpack on her shoulder and a mountain of unpaid bills in her mind. She heard footsteps stop at the library door, but she didn't look up at once, thinking it was a servant bringing afternoon tea. Then she felt the gaze, heavy and warm at the same time, the kind of gaze she had only ever felt from one person in this house, and she raised her head. Elias stood in the library doorway, and Celeste stopped breathing. Not because he was handsome, though he was handsome in the particular way of a man who had walked through hell and survived it, but because for the first time since she had known him, she saw him truly standing straight, back straight, shoulders broad, both feet steady on the wooden floor, not holding onto a bedpost, not leaning against a wall, not needing anyone to support him. He was wearing a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up and dark trousers, and though his body was still leaner than the imposing figure she had once glimpsed at the clinic a year earlier, the lines of his face had sharpened again. His jaw looked stronger, and his blue eyes, the eyes she had seen in every state from pain to anger to mockery to weakness to deadly cold, were now shining with something she had never seen in them before, the light of a man who was alive, truly alive, not merely existing, but living. He walked into the library, came straight to her, and sat down in the chair opposite. He took both of her hands in his. The book slipped from her lap to the floor with a soft thud that neither of them cared to pick up, and he looked straight into her eyes. "Marry me." 2 words. No roses, no diamond ring, no kneeling, no speech. 2 direct, decisive words, perfectly in keeping with the Mafia boss she had fallen in love with from the night he called for his mother in delirium. Celeste looked at him, her lips parting, her heart beating so fast she could hear it in her ears, and he continued, his voice lower now, but each word heavier than gold. "I know I'm Mafia. I know life with me isn't safe, isn't normal, isn't the kind of life you deserve. But I also know that no one in this world will ever love you more than I do, and no one in this world will ever protect you better than I will. I lost 9 months of my life to someone who wanted me dead, and in those 9 months, you were the only month worth living." Celeste looked at him, the man she had helped lie down on that first night, had shaved by candlelight, had kissed in the middle of terror, had sat beside in the lavender garden while they shared their wounds, and she smiled. The first truly radiant smile on her thin face after 3 years of not eating enough, the smile she had believed died with her husband and child. "Yes," she said, "but on one condition." He lifted an eyebrow, and his blue eyes flashed with interest. "You helped me build a hospital. A real hospital. A place where women are trained as doctors. A place where no one is fired for daring to be right when someone else is wrong." Elias smiled. The smile that had taken her weeks to see for the first time in the midnight garden. The smile she would now see every day for the rest of her life. "Deal." He drew her toward him, and this kiss was nothing like their first kiss in the terrible night. Not trembling, not salted with tears, not desperate. This kiss was slow, deep, warm, and carried the promise of a future both of them had once believed they had no right even to dream of. And among the old books on the oak shelves, in the October afternoon, sunlight falling in golden bands across the library floor, amid the scent of old paper and the drifting gold of dust in the air, the two of them found each other and decided they would never let go again. 12 months later, on a spring morning, when the first light of the new day slipped through the bedroom curtains and cast warm golden streaks across the white sheets, Elias Kade woke to a scent. Not the bitter smell of medicine, not the damp odor of sweat, not the stale air of a room sealed behind heavy curtains. Lavender. Sweet, light, and so familiar that it pulled him backward into childhood before he even opened his eyes, back to mornings when his mother would place a sprig of lavender beside his pillow, and he would wake to that gentle fragrance greeting the day. He opened his eyes and saw Celeste standing beside the bed, arranging fresh lavender stems in the white porcelain vase on the bedside table. Her dark brown hair fell loose over her shoulders, the morning light resting softly on her face, and she was beautiful in a way he could never have imagined, 12 months earlier, that he would be allowed to witness every single day. The beauty of a woman who was happy, who was loved, who carried new life within her. She turned, caught him watching her, and smiled. "Good morning." She leaned down and kissed him lightly on the mouth, and he pulled her closer, kissed her more deeply, then rested his hand on the rounded curve of her belly, where their first child was growing strong and healthy, and would be born in only a few more weeks. He felt the faint movement beneath his palm, a tiny kick, but full of life, and he smiled, a wide, warm, natural smile, the kind no one would have believed 12 months ago would ever appear again on the face of the Chicago Mafia boss. "Lavender," he said, his hand still resting on her belly. "You always know exactly what I need before I know it myself." Celeste lay down beside him, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, healthy rhythm of his heartbeat, so different now from the weak, erratic beat she had watched over through long nights in that dark room, thick with the smell of bitter medicine. His hair had grown back thick and black now, trimmed neatly short. His beard was kept clean. His body had regained most of its strength, though not all of what it once had been, but the arm wrapped around her was solid and warm, and the man lying beside her that morning was nothing like the gaunt ghost she had helped lower onto the bed on her first night in the house. "I got a letter from Finn this morning," Elias said, his voice gentle. "He's in Montana. Says he's starting over. Asked about me. Asked about you." Celeste lifted her head to look at him. "Did you write back yet?" "Not yet, but I will." Silence settled for a few seconds, light and peaceful, the kind of silence that didn't need filling. The wound Finn carried was still there, but it was healing, a little more each day, slowly and patiently, the way lavender returns every spring after a long winter. "Oh, Dorothy called early this morning," Celeste said, her voice touched with a secretive smile. "Bianca's daughter was born healthy. Little baby Kade just learned to roll over. She sent pictures." She picked up the phone from the bedside table, opened it, and handed it to him. Elias looked at the image on the screen, the tiny baby girl with round honey-colored eyes like Finn's, a bright, toothless smile that reminded him of someone he couldn't yet place, perhaps his mother in the black-and-white photograph hanging in the first-floor hallway. His niece, his blood, Finn's child, innocent of every sin her mother had committed. "She's beautiful," he said softly. "She looks like her Uncle Finn." He set the phone aside, held Celeste more tightly, and the two of them lay there in the morning light filled with the fragrance of lavender, listening to birds singing outside the window, and feeling the peace that had cost them far too much to find. "Celeste," he said. "Thank you for not running away on that first night." She laughed softly against his chest, her warm breath moving through the fabric of his shirt. "I almost did. But you were so irritable I stayed just to prove you wrong." Elias laughed, a full, rich, genuine laugh, the kind no one in the world would have believed, 9 months earlier, would ever echo again through the Kade mansion. The laugh of a man who was alive, truly alive, beside the woman who had saved him by refusing to step back. Outside the window, the estate garden was flooded with spring light. Lavender bloomed in vivid purple along the white gravel paths. The same lavender he had planted for his mother so many years ago, now blooming for his wife, for the child soon to be born, for the new life a determined nurse had made possible. A nurse who had been fired, burdened with debt, carrying a broken heart, and who had walked through the iron gates of a Mafia mansion in the darkness, and refused to give up when the rest of the world already had. And that is where the story of Elias and Celeste comes to its close. A journey through the deepest darkness of betrayal, to find the brightest light of true love. This story reminds us that sometimes the person who saves our life isn't the one with title or power, but the one brave enough to stay when everyone else leaves, patient enough to listen when no one else asks, and loving enough to fight for the person the world has already given up on. In real life, perhaps each of us has, at one time or another, been Celeste, standing before a closed door and having to decide whether to walk in or turn away. And perhaps somewhere there is also someone waiting, like Elias, waiting for a person who isn't afraid of their darkness. If today's story touched your heart, please press the like button so I'll know you were here with Elias and Celeste from beginning to end. Please share this video with the people you love, so they too can listen to stories that touch the deepest places in the heart. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now, so you won't miss the new stories coming every day. I would truly love to know how this story made you feel. Which moment moved you the most? Have you ever met someone in your life like Celeste? Someone who never gives up no matter how much stands against them? Or did you see yourself in Elias, in Finn, or in anyone else in this story? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every line and treasure every word you send from the depths of your heart. I wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and love. Thank you for spending your precious time walking beside today's story. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next video.